Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. One of the defining features of the Christian moral and spiritual life is the supernatural virtue of hope. What, however, is hope? Is it merely a positive disposition towards the future? If so, what distinguishes hope from a secular conception of optimism or even wish casting, projecting our desires out onto what lies ahead? What makes hope more than a mere superstition? What practical value, if any, does hope have for helping us live both individually and in community, including in our shared political life? Can hope have negative consequences, like motivating people to remain passive in the face of injustice? And what, if any, evangelical significance does hope have? Here to help us get clarity on these and related questions, and to give us 5 reasons why he believes we have reason to be hopeful for the new year, is Bishop Robert Barron. Well, Bishop, welcome back to the studio on this very snowy, very Minnesota-y day.
Yeah, it is.
So today we're going to be looking at the topic of hope and connected to that, some reasons that you have for us to be hopeful in the new year. This episode is going to be coming out right before 2025.
Okay.
But before we do, give us a sense of some of the highlights for you from this past year, both in your work in the Diocese of Winona, Rochester, and also at with your work at Word on Fire.
Yeah, well, this past year for the diocese, certainly it's the inauguration of our new chancery office. So that was such a joy. I mean, the first 2 years as bishop here, it's been my main preoccupation, getting that building, funded and built. And there's a lot of headaches involved in putting up buildings, but it came out beautifully, and we dedicated it last September. So that was, for me, the highlight for the diocese for sure. And then also I'd say ordaining the first priest I've ordained for our diocese last May. I'd ordained priests before, but the first one's now where I'm the bishop of the diocese, and that was a great joy. So those 2 things I'd say. My Word on Fire. Well, there's also the synod. I was in Rome for the entire month of October, and then Prague right afterwards. And then Word on Fire has just been kind of going from strength to strength. There were so many projects we've done. That little book on prayer we came out with in anticipation of the Jubilee year, and that's as we record these words, sold about 350,000 copies.
Yeah,
I
that's
think.
right.
So, really delighted with all that. But all of our projects have been going, super well.
Many blessings. So let's move now into talking about hope.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we're going to be talking about some very specific things looking to the new year. But we want to first, as we usually do, lay some groundwork for a Catholic, a Christian understanding of what hope is. So I think hope is one of those concepts. Everybody has an intuitive sense of what it means. It's sort of has a colloquial meaning. But what's specifically the Christian and even Catholic conception of hope? How would we want to define it?
Well, you have to see it, first of all, as a theological virtue, along with faith and love. And that means it has to have something explicitly to do with the grace of God. In the case of hope, it's an ordering of one's life toward a properly supernatural end. That's how I would characterize it. So it certainly doesn't mean something like, casual optimism or expectation or, oh, I sure hope so, and hope those Cubs win next year and that sort of thing. It has a very precise theological meaning. My life is now ordered toward a supernatural end. And so I live in hope. I live in anticipation of and orientation toward that ultimate supernatural end that transcends this world. And that's extremely important, that the goal of my life ultimately is outside of this life, right? And your whole life will change once that happens, once that theological virtue takes hold, and that only comes through grace. Your life takes on an entirely different tone and tenor.
So if we locate hope within the theological realm, identified as a theological virtue, as a supernatural virtue, does that mean that hope is only related to faith, or is there a reason? Is there a way in which reason can also be related to hope?
Sure, in the measure that faith, hope, and love don't contradict the natural order. So faith doesn't come below reason; it's not opposed to reason. It's always beyond reason. Same with hope and with love; they go beyond but include virtues more associated with our ordinary experience. That's the beauty of the Catholic imagination. So grace perfects and elevates nature. It doesn't negate it. It doesn't run away from nature. It takes nature and then raises it to a higher pitch. I often think of like the link between a square in 2 dimensions and a cube in 3 dimensions. It doesn't negate the square. It raises the square up to a higher pitch of existence. That's what the theological virtues do.
And locating again hope in this in the theological sphere and tying it to our final end, both individually and we could even say eschatologically too.
Yeah.
The final end of all human life and all life itself. What practical value can we say that hope has in terms of our everyday lives, both individually and as a people and as a church?
Yeah, it has enormous practical value. That every decision you make, in a way, will be predicated upon that sense of the ultimate end. And so, even your decisions about, what you're going to buy, where you'll be educated, what kind of job you'll have, whom you'll marry. I mean, all those things that are, you might say, practical decisions we make within our ordinary experience. They're all predicated upon hope. They're all predicated upon the ultimate orientation toward fulfillment in God. So again, it's not an either or game. It's always a both and game. Hope enlivens ordinary experience. It gives it a new depth and tone. The practical decisions you make are going to be conditioned in every way by the hope that you have. So it makes life interesting. It adds a dimension to it, I would say, that other people wouldn't have.
And how do we distinguish before we look at some potential rival conceptions of hope from the secular sphere? Hope and faith. I think oftentimes there's confusion saying, well, isn't hope and faith ultimately the same thing? It's about believing in something that's out there in the future.
Well, fair enough. You could say it very broadly, but faith is the opening of the door to the spiritual life. Faith is the awareness of God, the awareness of a higher dimension. Hope is more oriented toward sort of the action of your life, where your moral life is tending ultimately, and it's toward God. So you can't have hope without faith, because you can't really have love without faith. All three are interrelated, right? They're like the 3 legs on a stool or something. You can't have one without the other. But hope has to do with, I think, action and direction in your life.
Why this question just comes up? It's again related to the 3 theological virtues. Why is love then sort of the greatest theological virtue if they're necessarily implicative?
Because in the ultimate fulfillment, faith will fall away because you'll have vision. You won't need faith. And hope will fall away because you will have attained it. See, hope is an orientation toward an end that I don't have yet. But once I have it, hope will fall away. But what remains is love, because love is what eternal life is. That's why Paul will say that, there are 3 things that last, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And that's the Aquinas specifies that way, because faith and hope fall away in heaven. It's like, with the sacraments, we really receive the body and blood of Jesus in the Eucharist, but we do so under sacramental signs. In heaven, we'll be in direct and full communion. The sacramental sign will fall away, and the reality is fully present, So it has to do in a way with the veiled nature of life here, that we have these things, but always like through a glass darkly, as Paul says. But then we'll see the Lord as he really is. We'll have the beatific vision.
So let's now compare it to some common, what some may say are analogous concepts in the secular sphere. For example, what's the relationship between saying, well, I'm being hopeful and I'm being optimistic? Is there any overlap there?
And there might be some overlap, but I would sharply distinguish them, really. Because someone can be optimistic about things within this world based upon calculations and, analyses of what's going on. So you could say, hey, I hope, or rather, I'm optimistic that the Cubs will win, the World Series next year. Okay, based on certain, moves they've made and certain calculations that I've made, I can be, guardedly optimistic about that. But hope isn't about predictions or expectations within ordinary experience. It's an ordering toward the supernatural end. That's why you can be full of hope and still be incredibly pessimistic about the world. I mean, you might say, no, our political situation, it's terrible and getting worse. The Cubs are terrible and they're going to be worse next year. You can be completely pessimistic about economics, politics, sports, and still be full of hope, because they're sort of like modally different moves. And you can be both. I can be optimistic relatively about affairs within the world and full of hope about my supernatural end. But I think they should be sharply distinguished. That's why some people might have a very even morose attitude, and they might seem very negative about things in the world. Okay, fair enough. It doesn't mean they're without hope.
Could we say that, for example, like the dark mystics, like St. John of the
Yeah,
Cross, who oftentimes come up, we could say that even a figure like that is hopeful?
sure. Yeah, because a saint is someone that has these virtues to a heroic degree. So I'd say almost by definition, a saint is someone who's living in very radical hope. But they can be very pessimistic about the world, you know, have a very dark take on human nature or on politics or something. Those are not mutually exclusive.
Let's now turn to the potential critiques of the whole idea
Yeah.
of hope. As you know, there's entire ideologies and philosophies whose express aim is to try and take away hope from humanity on the pretext that it's something both false and poisonous. And the example we were discussing before we started rolling the cameras is we see this in John Lennon's famous or
Yeah.
perhaps infamous song "Imagine." Where do those kinds of philosophies and ideologies go wrong on the nature of hope?
Well, yeah, because you have to have a supernatural perspective. If you don't have that, then you're just caught up in this world, and you can be giddily optimistic about it for certain reasons. You can be radically pessimistic about it for other reasons, and in a way, neither one of those positions has a thing to do with authentic hope. And it's not just about imagining scenarios that we could come up with within this world. Like, wouldn't it be great if, you know, as John Lennon was saying, no possessions and imagine this. But that's not what hope's about. Hope is about what God has opened for us. He's opened the door to this higher vision of things. And then whether things are going well politically or not, whether it corresponds to my, expectations, it doesn't matter. There's something qualitatively different at play when you're talking about hope.
What about the argument that hope is ultimately just a psychological crutch? That the whole reason it exists, the whole reason we have a category for it, perhaps we can even link it to Freud, is because we need to have hope in order to function. But that doesn't necessarily mean it corresponds with any exterior reality.
Well, and that's, from the time at least of Feuerbach, that's a standard critique,
Mhm.
that religion is wishful thinking. It's a projection of our idealized self-image. In Freud, it's like a waking dream. My unconscious produces these lovely dreams when I'm asleep, and there's kind of a waking dream we call religion. Like, wouldn't it be wonderful if we live forever and so on? But again, that's putting everything within a immanentist framework. It's just talking about human psychology, and hope is something else. It means you've been given access to a higher world. Now, there's a lot of ways we can talk about that. That's the whole realm of faith. How that world opens up to you. But it's different than something of my own concoction. It's different than a mere psychological frame of mind, whether that's positive or negative. Um, it's something else, something totalitaire, right? Something totally other has broken into my life. Think of Paul Tillich's language of this, the breakthrough of the unconditioned into my experience.
Mhm.
That's not something I'm controlling. By definition, I'm
Right.
not controlling that. And now how that happens, that's a whole question of revelation and fundamental theology. Um, it happens, look at the Bible, is where you see accounts of it. But the point that I'm making is it's completely different than anything like psychological projection or a game that I'm playing, to make myself feel better.
Mhm.
And to me, always the great refutation of Feuerbach and Freud is the cross of Jesus.
Right.
Would anybody who thinks religion is just a fulfilling prophecy or it's a wish fulfilling fantasy ever come up with the cross? That we put before our eyes is this person being brutally put to death on a cross. That doesn't look like wish fulfilling fantasy, to me, or what you come up with on your own. That there's something so deeply strange about Christianity, and it militates against that sort of facile psychologism.
Is it also fair to say that even if we do have psychological benefit from a proper understanding of hope,
Sure.
that doesn't disprove
No,
hope?
no, that's a fair point, and that's really what we're saying. It's an example of what we're saying earlier. Is that grace elevates and perfects
Yeah,
nature,
right.
and so sure that your hope can indeed give you a sort of a sunnier psychological frame of mind. It needn't, though. We have to keep the distinction in mind. I'm like, oh, I'm not feeling sunny today, therefore I've lost hope. Well, no, that's
Right.
not true. But sure, the whole purpose of the theological virtues is to raise up our psychology and so on, our even our physiology. Um, but look at someone like Mother Teresa. It's a very interesting test case because here's a woman who lived in some of the worst conditions on the planet. I've been there. I've been to the slums of Calcutta. Horrific. More to it, we know that now from her journals and letters. She lived in great psychological turmoil
Mhm.
much of her life. Much of her life. She lived in, I don't want to use the word depression would be too strong, but she lived in, I'd call it, a psychological distress most of her life. Does that mean she was lacking hope? No, no, no. In fact, the hope is what explains Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Hope explains the whole of her life. Smiling, through the tears and so on. But this deeper dimension of life opened up for her. And the ordinary side of her life remained in many ways, a suffering state of being. Okay, hope is different than that.
So we've been speaking relatively abstractly about the nature of
Yeah.
hope, but now let's turn to some specific things that
Yeah.
that we have good reason to be hopeful for, tying it to the fact that we're at the end of 2024, we're going
Yeah.
into 2025. So there's lots of things we could talk about. We've narrowed it down to just a few of them. So here's
Okay.
here's reason number one: the number of nuns, and I'm probably most of those in your audience know what that means, but just in case, it's
Yeah.
those who do not identify with any religious tradition appears to have peaked and plateaued and may even be dropping, while at the same time, the sales of Bibles, the
Yeah.
actual physical Bibles, is up 22% from since a year ago. Does that make you hopeful,
Yeah.
and why?
Yeah, and precisely as we've been describing it, it doesn't just make me optimistic, it makes me hopeful because it's an orientation toward this higher dimension of life. I think the New Atheists had their day, 20-some years ago. As I've said, their message ultimately was, we come from nothing, we go to nothing, there's no objective value, life has no meaning whatsoever. I think once people heard that and let it sink in, once they got over there, hey, I don't like religion, and stick it to the man and all that. Once they got over that and they realized what vapid, depressing message this
Yeah,
was,
right.
they began to turn, toward deeper places. And then I give a lot of credit to my friend Jordan Peterson and others like him who started talking about religion in a compelling way. And the fact I've told Jordan this, that the fact that he's not a clergyman, I think helped a lot
Hmm.
because we're coming out of the scandals and people, they're suspicious of institutions and all that. The fact that here's this layman, wearing a coat and tie and not really explicitly religious, but talking about the Bible and spiritual things in a serious way, I think that got people interested. I know it did. The uptick in Bible sales, and look, it benefited us at Word on Fire with our beautiful Word on
Absolutely.
Fire Bible that people bought in great numbers. But I give Peterson and others a lot of credit for opening the door to rethink these texts. And, in a way, I've said this publicly, it's a judgment on us here, I mean religious leaders, that we weren't doing something that people like Peterson managed to do. They talked about our great book in a way that people found compelling.
Hmm.
And I mean, this is another show we could do, but we got distracted by so many other things.
Right.
And we stopped talking in a compelling way about our primary text and so on. So I am hopeful, and it's the right word to use, not optimistic, but hopeful, because it looks as though people are getting intrigued by this higher world.
I looked into some of the underlying numbers, specifically
Yeah,
within Bible sales, and it's something that really uh, I find fascinating. Is almost all of those sales come from first time purchases,
that is interesting.
and many of them have been influenced by an influencer online. So I don't know
Yeah,
if you're aware of this, Bishop, but now a new trend is unboxing the Bible when you get it shipped to your
yeah,
home.
yeah.
Who would have thought even a year ago that would go viral?
No,
Buying a Bible and sharing it online.
also, I mean, Bibles are always sold, well, but you might say, well, because it's a gift for a confirmation or someone buys it for the house to put it on display. But you get the impression people are buying it now actually to read it,
Yeah,
which is a good
the greatest
sign.
surprise.
Yeah, but that is, because they've seen the power of these ancient texts, and they're so facilely written off by, goofballs like the New Atheists, who have no idea how to read these texts. When you have Dawkins and those guys, carrying on as though it's just old, Bronze Age science
Yeah.
that's outmoded. That means they're clueless in regard to knowing how to read these texts, how they functioned in the great tradition, how they've been read by the geniuses of the West. So, I mean, that's what to me is so annoyingly superficial about the New Atheist critique of the Bible. And so, again, thank God, I'd say, for Peterson and others who've kind of opened the door to read these texts more adequately.
All right, reason number 2 to be hopeful. Woke ideology is losing its grip on the culture, including in entertainment and politics, education, and commerce, among other areas, including religion as well. So, Bishop, you've long been a critic of wokeism.
Yeah.
What do you think is leading to this decline?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. First of all, I am very happy about that, and I think there are all kinds of signs that wokeism has certainly peaked and is now in decline. I think people have realized how destructive it is, the way it's pitted us against each other in a very brutal way, how it's locked us into permanently antagonistic groups of oppressors and oppressed, how it's really obviated real justice. By all this groupthink and identity politics and prescinding from the case in front of you of what's really just or unjust. Wokeism tends to move away from that to these abstractions.
Right.
Um, so I think people have just they've sensed that, they've felt it, how destructive and unfair and unjust and antagonistic this social theory is. And what I'm hopeful about is that can open the door to Catholic social teaching, which is far more hopeful because it's finally oriented toward something sacred. Something I have talked about, I think it's interesting. Look at the social protests of the 50s and 60s, right? Not just participated in by a lot of Christians, led by Christians like Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and others. That's an interesting thing, that movement had a supernatural orientation. It was King's reading of the biblical text that gave rise to the civil rights movement. Why were religious people so conspicuous by their absence in 2020 when these terrible social protests in the summer of 2020? There are hardly any religious involvement. Well, because wokeism, as I've often argued, is undergirded not by the Bible, but by Marxism and by a sort of arid postmodernism. So religious people weren't really welcome. The leaders of wokeism don't want religion involved.
Right, exactly.
They don't want this perspective we've been talking about, that what we do in this world is predicated upon an orientation toward another world. Think of Martin Luther King's last great speech the night before he was assassinated about the mountaintop, and he's talking about eternal life, and he's seen what the prophets saw. Well, that's a very, very different game than the leaders of the wokist movement. So I'm happy to see it on the rocks, and going under.
Yeah, it seems part of the shift has been from seeing religion in general and Christianity in particular as part of the problem to now a sense of seeing it as not only part of the solution, but maybe even a necessary part of the solution.
Yes, yes, and I think that's true. That when you bracket the supernatural, you make things worse at the natural level. And all the enemies of religion, going back now into the early modern period, they saw it the opposite way. The way to improve social conditions in this world is get rid of all this dreaming about another world, and that's Feuerbach and Marx and everybody else. Au contraire, it seems to me, the more you're oriented toward a supernatural goal, the more effectively you'll engage things in this world. And that is a major difference between, let's say, the 50s and the wokest stuff going on today.
All right. Reason number 3. It seems that Protestants and Catholics are getting along and working together more than ever before, at least in the United States. Say a little bit about your experience in the ecumenical realm.
I don't have vast experience, but some I've had over the years of dialogue with, and I always enjoy those conversations. Here's my sense: is Catholics have an easier time dealing with and talking to evangelical Protestants than mainstream Protestants, because the mainstream Protestant churches have tended to go just in a very secularist, liberal direction, where the evangelicals have stayed with the Bible. And I think we can find a lot of common ground. And that might be ironic, given, Luther wanted to move to the Bible. But I think it's biblically minded people today, both Catholic and Protestant, have a lot in common. And we've certainly found common ground in regard to a lot of the social issues. What I've tried to urge in conversations I've had is good. First of all, we're not killing each other. Secondly, we're not berating each other. Thirdly, we have found common ground on moral issues. So maybe now we can engage some of the doctrinal issues, which I think remain. In my experience, we still get back to the 16th century and justification and sacraments and papal authority and all those things. But, to your point, I think it is certainly more hopeful than it was, let's say, pre-Vatican II. where there was hardly any real ecumenical conversations. So, yeah, I find that hopeful.
My dad has shared. He grew up in Milwaukee, and my dad shared stories from his early life when he first became aware of religion. That he had a sense that he wasn't supposed to talk to the Lutherans,
Mhm.
even though they
Yeah,
shared all the same spaces. That kind of thing appears to have just totally died, right? This
I think
idea
so,
that
yeah.
there's no mixing among the denominations.
No, and that's a great step that was taken at the council and afterwards.
Uh huh.
We found a much better space to be in dialogue with each other. The danger was, as I say, the drift toward a sort of secularizing liberalism. That
Hmm.
didn't help the conversation. I think those who stayed in a biblical framework find much more common ground.
All right, reason number 4, and I know this one is very close to your heart. Notre Dame in Paris
Yeah,
has reopened to great global fanfare.
yeah,
So many heads of states, including our incoming president, were there for that
yeah.
event. So why does that give you hope, and what's significant about that? That a church reopening becomes a global news event.
Right. And gosh, I go back to 5 years ago and that awful fire, and it broke my heart because maybe as many of the listeners know, I have a strong relationship to Notre Dame, having studied in Paris and lived there for 3 years. And I gave tours for all those years, once a week at Notre Dame. So I came to know that building really well. And what I used to do when I was there, I'd use it as a chance to preach, 'cause I didn't have a chance to preach very often when I was a doctoral student. But I'd get, these 70 or 100 people for the tour, and then I'd use the cathedral as a visual aid. I'd talk about basically the supernatural life. So that's what I'm finding properly hopeful about it. Not just, oh, this beautiful building from, the Middle Ages has been restored and
Right.
how lovely it looks. That's all true. But it's the ordering toward the supernatural that building gives us. It was meant to do that to us. The upward thrusting lines of the Gothic cathedral, the pointed arches and all that, meant to raise us up to a contemplation of God. The window, so Gothic opens these huge spaces in the walls for windows, for colored glass, and it floods the building with light. And you really saw it in the renewed Notre Dame. It's
Yeah.
not this gloomy, we think gloomy Gothic. Gothic wasn't gloomy. It was meant to be a well lighted space because light is associated with God and with the
Hmm.
Holy Spirit. So it's flooded with the supernatural as the building lifts the heart up toward the supernatural. You look at Notre Dame on the Ile de la Cité, and it's got the flying buttresses coming out the side that look like oars. And that central narrow section called the nave, navis in Latin means ship. It's the great ship of the church that's moving us through space and time toward eternity, you know? Then you look at, for example, the North Rose window, which is, I think, one of the most beautiful images in all the Western art. But the whole window is predicated upon the number 8. The 8 circles around the center, then 16, then twice 16, then 32, and so on. And you add them all up and you get 88. So the whole window is a meditation upon 8. What's 8 but the number of eternity? It
Hmm.
stands outside the 7 days of the week, the
Right. Right.
cycle of time. So that window is meant to anticipate the beatific vision when we see God face to face. My point is, everything in that building is ordered toward the supernatural, right? And so it's ordered toward hope. That's where I'm going, where that building is indicating. If you just see it as a pretty structure from long ago that we've nicely restored, fair enough. But then you're missing the real point of it. The point is it awakens hope in people, and I think they might even know that, but inchoately, unconsciously, they know what that building is doing, how it's speaking of a higher world, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Do you think that helps explain why there were so many heads of state
Yeah,
who attended the reopening?
I think they got it at some level.
Uh,
They might not even be able to explicitly articulate it, but I think they got the spiritual significance of a building
yeah,
like
it's
that.
more than just culturally
More than
significant.
just cultural, more than just aesthetic. What I was on NBC doing a little commentary of the opening ceremony, and there was a lot of talk, and it's right as far as it goes about the cultural and artistic importance of the building. So whenever they turned to me, I tried to bring the
Yeah.
properly supernatural and theological into it. At the end, they said to me, Bishop, any final thoughts? And I said, yeah, my final thought is about Notre Dame, Our Lady, who's this young Galilean girl that hears the message of an angel to become the mother of God. And that little girl in this obscure, town, this glorious building, which is now attracting the whole world, is dedicated to her,
Hmm.
dedicated to the mother of God, who brought the incarnate Lord into the world. I want it to be. The reaction was, "Oh, good," But that's what that building is meant to do.
And a final reason number five is the church is growing by leaps and bounds in some regions of the world, and
Yeah.
also growing right here in your own diocese.
Yeah, and especially the vocations,
Yeah.
which I made a high priority when I became bishop here, and we now have 27 or 28 seminarians. There were 20 when I got here, and I made it a very high priority. And I've told the people wherever I go in this diocese, I'll say, okay, everybody, we need priests. Our priests are aging, are approaching retirement. You want the church to continue. And I'll quote John Paul, the Ecclesia de Eucharistia. The church comes from the Eucharist. And I said, and the Eucharist comes from priests.
Right.
So no priests, no church. It's as simple as that. So, please God, and we'll keep praying about that. But yeah, that to me is a great sign of hope. Because look, what are priests? Priests are there to orient people toward the supernatural. Again, with the critics always in mind, the supernatural that contains the natural elevates and perfects it. So, they're running away from this world. No. The properly supernatural is always inclusive of this world and wants to elevate it and raise it up. Hence the work of a priest, But if no one speaks of the Trinity and of eternal life and of grace and of salvation and the sacraments, well, then we lose hope, literally.
Bishop, it's now time for our listener question. So today we have Jose asking about how we might be able to use prayer to get us out of spiritual darkness.
For a couple of months, I've been feeling lost, detached from God. As of recently, my wife got recently sick, and she's not a believer, but one night she told me to pray for her. And I feel like I haven't been unworthy or don't have the strength or have the belief anymore to pray, because I believe that prayer doesn't lead to anywhere. I just don't know where to get that strength back.
Yeah, I appreciate that question very much. And there are a lot of people I know in that same spiritual state. Here's the first observation. Your wife asking for prayer, that's a grace. That in itself is a grace. And it's the Lord, I would say, working through her, awakening something in you. How do you learn to pray? One answer is by praying. Don't wait for something to happen, which will then prompt you to pray. Like, I've got to find some perfect clarity in my mind before I can pray. I think you learn to pray by praying. I also think of Jose Maria Escriva's great line about if you don't know how to pray, gather yourself, put yourself in the presence of the Lord, and you say, Lord, I don't know how to pray. And he said, at that moment, you're praying. So prayer is a conversation with the Lord. Whatever is good and right and beautiful in your prayer is God already praying in you. It's the Lord has prompted you even to ask this question of me is a grace. It's the Lord operating in you. So I would learn to pray by praying and take your wife's question as itself a grace and a prompt to prayer.
Well, thank you so much, Jose, for reaching out to us. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question for a future Word on Fire show episode, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com, and we really love to hear from you. All right, Bishop, we've come to the end again. Lots of reasons for hope moving forward. Thank you.
Always great talking to you, Matt. Thanks.
Likewise. That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time.